as we're watching the unions now want regulation, or so they say, right? We don't really know if that's actually what they want. They may just need that as a talking point or a pressure point. But as the unions say that they would like regulation of these legacy media companies, I'm curious how much of monopoly discussions and regulation discussions come from a political place rather than an economic optimization place. And then how do you think that the government, as it's currently constituted, and I think it's currently constituted in such a way as mostly at the federal level and highest levels of states to act as a power broker right now, as opposed to being some sort of democratic institution. But how do you think that the government would balance the fact that it seems like both of these parties belong to the same political persuasion, and therefore they probably don't want to get involved? How does this all play out on that side of it?
Well, I think you've seen so far that it has not played out at all because, for example, the reason that you've identified, Pro, they're both, these are two different components and important ones of the left. And first of all, when we look at writers' unions and actors' unions, we're not looking here at tradesmen's unions. We're not looking here. They're related. They're related. They're part of conglomerated unions. And as Valley and I were talking about it in the video that we recorded on Friday, you see in that antitrust report a lot of the same kind of language that you would expect from the United Auto Workers or the steelworkers unions in the 60s and 70s. Some modern jargon in there, but by and large, still the same kind of class warfare rhetoric. Doesn't really make a lot of sense in this context. Which is a little bit ironic because to a large extent, the unions are representing a lot of non-celebrity talent in Hollywood.
Right. And you might say from a quantity of individuals involved, far more have no name that we know publicly. But in terms of the power, it's the inverse of that, of course.
Mm-hmm. Right. And on the other hand, you have on the management side, robber barons whose wealth would embarrass, Morgan, I think, and whose cultural influence. I mean, again, we're using, look, the Sherman Act, which is the daddy of the antitrust laws, was enacted in 1895. Even I wasn't around in 1895. Okay, that's a hell of a long time ago. The paradigms, because of what's happened to politics in this country, intellectual property law, trade law, antitrust law, nothing meaningful really has changed. There's been very little recognition of the sort of changes that we're talking about here in the legislation or in the agencies that are supposed to enforce this legislation, because our government no longer works as a policymaking organ. It's, as you acknowledge, it's all about what we in economics, my major, call rent seeking. It's all about power brokering. So I think which is why I think they're standing aside, basically the Democratic controlled executive branch is standing aside here because they don't really know which side to put the thumb on the scale for. So that's a confusing aspect of this. And, there's so much of this goes in so many directions. You're right. There's a political angle to this as well as an economic angle, but politics to a large extent in the 21st century is about money, as we see with Hunter Biden and Joe Biden. That's why Joe Biden's in politics, is to become rich. That's why the Clintons,
a lot of them are. Yeah, that's for sure.
The majority of them are in politics for become rich. I mean, when you take a look at what the supposed salaries of a political representative is and how much they actually make after winning numerous terms, you're like, how does that reconcile? Like,
exactly.
Yeah, and there's a couple of things in here I kind of want to go over before I'm going to maybe deviate from this for a bit, because we have a guest joining us right now. I wanted to bring her in because I thought this was going to be a fun conversation to have with her as well. Welcome back, Miss Lorena Creole. Good to see you.
Hello. Good to
Lorena.
see you, Valiant. Good to see you,
Nice to
Pro
meet you.
Script Doctor, and
Lorena,
Ron
meet
Coleman.
Ron Coleman. Meet
How do you do,
Creole.
Lorena?
I'm doing well. Nice to meet you.
Same here.
So, we were talking about the antitrust issue, and Ron's got some experience on the legal side and that. We did a video this morning. It was on his podcast last week. And I the first question is, how do you get 250,000 followers on Twitter? Because I want to know how to do that, because I can't figure that one out yet.
I do too. Sure.
Yeah. So this is going to kind of tie in, because we've got this, this new report from University of Southern California. We're going to get to that next.
Mhm.
We need to have more DEI in Hollywood, according to this survey. Somehow.
Actually,
So
that reminds me of one more point I wanted to make on the antitrust point, in which somebody just mentioned in the chat, which is that one final thing we need to consider when we look at antitrust and the prospective regulation of media companies is the First Amendment.
Mm-hmm.
Media companies make communications. They sell ideas. They sell the embodiment ideas. They communicate their content as deserving as it may be or otherwise is protected by the First Amendment in ways that widgets aren't. And that makes it particularly difficult. In other words, throughout this discussion, we have been alluding to the question of, is there going to be an effect on content quality if there is a restricted market? Federal judges and regulators really have nothing to say about content quality, and they should not. And that makes it particularly hairy to contemplate the idea of regulating producers of content.
Yeah, I think you're right, because we've seen just recently how quick these big entertainment and media companies will whip out the First Amendment argument. Disney did it against Florida, stupidly, saying that, well, you took away our private government that we didn't have a right to, so you violated our free speech. I don't think that argument's going to fly. But what you're talking about, I think I'm sure that would be one of the first lines of defense in a federal antitrust case if that were to ever become an actual issue.
Here's a question. Did Disney's private government have a constitution that protected free speech? Because if it didn't, I don't think they have any footing to stand on there.
Let's save that for Andrew. This is his.
Yeah. That was a gift by the Florida legislature. It's the legislature may give it, the legislature may take it away. That's it's not a right, it's a privilege, and that's the difference. That's why. And the thing is that of course the former Reedy Creek is not owned by Disney. It's not part of Disney's corporate structure. It's a tax body. It's a government that's owned by the state of Florida, effectively, or the public, right? So to say that, well, you didn't let us control this government anymore, it's like, well, you didn't have a right to control it in the first place.
Right. You didn't have the right to authoritarianly control which 8 citizens could exist inside this city that was supposed to be real.
Yeah.
And let's not
turned
get
into
into
a cul-de-sac.
Right. And let's not get into how they got it in the first place, basically.
Yeah.
I have relatives, and most Floridians are like, Disney basically stole that land from the state of Florida.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like
For
a
the most
Jonestown,
part.
essentially.